All right. Well, Anna, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you guys.
Yeah.
This is a topic that we have had on the list for at least a couple of years because this is something people consistently send messages about and it feels like a topic that is complicated because there are so many different experiences and so I totally recognize that this won't be an all-encompassing episode and hopefully will be the first of many, but we're just really grateful that you were open to digging in with us for the first time. And I wondered if just to start, if you'd be willing to just talk about your own experience with divorce. And I think something I'm really interested in and that I think can be a pain point for a lot of people is this idea of personal revelation and that role in divorce. So would you be open to just sharing your experience to get us started?
Yeah, I would love to. Um, there are a lot of dynamics in marriages and divorces. So it's hard to often pinpoint like what went wrong, when did it happen? There are often steps and processes along the way as you're navigating it. But I will share an experience when I felt the confidence to trust myself in making the decision for divorce. And I say that I chose divorce, which is hard because sometimes people don't choose it and the person that they're married to is choosing it. And so their experience can be different when they feel like it's being thrust upon them and it was somebody else's choice. But I've come to terms with accepting that I chose divorce. I utilized my agency for divorce. So I was actually the Young Women's president, and I don't recommend accepting a calling when you're going through some really tough stuff. But I was extended the call, and I don't know if it was out of duty or pressure, or, if I'm being honest, there might have been this hope that I would have some spiritual grounding in
Mhm.
focusing on a calling. But I accepted the calling. My marriage was not in a place that it was complete turmoil right then. It had been in the past, but it actually was it was still very hollow in lots of ways, but it was a very steady place. And I accepted this calling and dove right into it. And I think I was only in the calling for about 4.5 weeks. Um, but while I was in that calling, when you're called to something in our faith, you think that it's your chance, opportunity, and responsibility to serve others, to teach them the gospel, to offer your skills. And what happened was I was reminded of all the things that I had learned, not only as a child, but also as a young woman, and that I needed to relearn as a grown woman that I was a daughter of God. And all the things that I had been taught, practiced, questioned, engaged in, I needed to be reminded. So I was being restored to my understanding of what the gospel of Jesus Christ was. And I felt like that calling was very preparatory for me to actually make a decision to file for divorce. And like I said, there are a lot of other stories and examples. Um, Sometimes when people ask about divorces, they want to know, like, what happened? And so if you have a quick, witty answer, then that solves it and people can go about their day. But that's not even close to what a divorce experience is really like. Just like if you're processing the loss of a spouse or dealing with cancer or deconstructing your faith, there are so many layers and elements at play. But I'm really grateful for that sacred time of a calling that reminded me that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone, and it is also specifically for me in my life. And then, as that calling was part of my life, there was an incident that happened, and I just had the courage, strength, faith, whatever you want to call it, to be able to say that I was going to file for divorce. And I did. And I think sometimes the Lord protects you when you have to do really hard things. Might be adrenaline, it might be protection from the Holy Ghost, but I was able to make a decision that I didn't want to make. I prayed for a lot of years for my marriage to be saved or healed. And quite honestly, I thought that I could fix it. I spent lots of years thinking I could fix it. And I knew if I couldn't fix it, that God could fix it. But He was not going to take away someone's agency. He wasn't going to take away the ability to choose. So it's hard with divorce because we can't wait for God to tell us yes or no, just like with marriage, just like with moves, just like with anything you do in your life. But he can give his blessing, and then you have to do all you can to sanctify that choice.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
I when you told the story about the calling and sort of like having that particular moment in your life reinforce the the idea that you're a daughter of God, it made me wonder if one of the more difficult parts about divorce might be sort of an issue of identity, where, like I think, and I've seen this in so many different aspects. I think things can be difficult, and there are lots of different challenges that we face, but the most difficult ones are often the ones that call into question identity that we've sort of formed about ourselves. And so I
Yes.
wonder if, in your case, if you feel like you did form some identity around, I'm a I'm not just a daughter of God, but I'm a successful Mormon in some ways. Like I'm a married woman who is checking those boxes. And I wonder if part of the difficulty is like needing to deconstruct that, but also that you felt caught in some ways by this more real, deeper identity as a daughter of God.
Right. I was fairly confident that if there were two things I was going to be amazing at, it was going to be a wife and mother. And so when you have one of those identities stripped away, and it's something that I felt honestly confident in, I was like, I can do this. I'm not going to be perfect at it, but I can do this. And so when I was faced with the idea of like, I'm not going to have a title of being a wife, and then I have to have the title of being divorced, and I still have to show up somehow in my faith, surrounded by traditional viewpoints of what a family should look like, and a really, really strong emphasis that it has to look like the perfect Christmas card. And that's hard to come to terms with. That's really hard to come to terms with.
Yeah.
Can I ask you how you have reconciled what I'm assuming you felt like was inspiration to get married? Because I know, of course, every story will be different, but I bet a lot of people will resonate with your experience, which is like it also felt like the right thing to do to get married. And like how do you think about those years that you were together? There must be some way to feel like that's integrated and that like divorce could be the right thing, marriage could be the right thing, and something about this time in between probably creates some tension. So can you just talk about how you think about that?
Yeah. One of my really good friends introduced me to a concept from her therapist called both and. You can have both of those experiences, and one can be right at the right time.
Mm,
So in regards to choosing marriage, I remember a specific time when I had come out of the temple. It was the day that I received my endowment, and we were taking pictures outside, and it was kind of cloudy, and the sun kind of opened up and shined down on us. And for me, that felt like God was kind of giving his blessing. And to be honest, it could have just been that the wind was blowing in the right direction. And so then the sky parted and there was some sun. But I think of that in the same regards to God was giving his blessing because it was a choice that I was making.
hmm
And the person that I chose to marry, and myself, we both had the opportunity to make of that marriage a thousand different things. There were millions of decisions that were made throughout the entire thing. And you don't need to get into black and white thinking, because I think if
Yeah.
you say, I wasn't supposed to marry that person, you lose sight of all of the growth that could have come.
Yeah.
And it's hard because we've been taught and shown, and all of the pamphlets like portray this viewpoint of mom and a dad, a husband and wife, and then their kids as the traditional Mormon. And so it's really challenging to come face to face with the idea that that's not what my family is going to look like. But that
hmm
doesn't mean I'm not still a disciple of Jesus Christ or a faithful member of our faith. And so I think of that in the same way when I chose to file for divorce. God said he was going to be there to bless that choice too. He wasn't going to leave me. And truth was, I thought I was making a decision that was healthy for my family. And I think people have a hard time with that too, because divorce sounds like this bad word that we say. And believe me, it was hard for me to say the word divorce in the beginning. I didn't want my kids to have to say it. I didn't want to have to say it. And now, unfortunately, it probably rolls right off my tongue very quickly, but also there's a level of normalizing it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. You brought up the fact that it can be difficult because of this sort of like idealized perception that we have of the nuclear family in the church.
Yeah.
Are there other aspects? And at the same time, you brought up this beautiful experience about knowing your true place in relationship to God that came from your faith that really helped. But I'm curious if there are other aspects of Mormonism in particular that for you or that you've seen commonly sort of like make the experience of divorce especially difficult in some ways.
Yeah, I think we really need to stop worshiping the appearance of an eternal family and start like honoring the real aspects of being a Christ-like person and choosing to incorporate Christ-like teachings, because we lose the humanness when we try to say it needs to look a certain way.
Hmm.
In fact, the most amazing relationships that I have with people is because we're willing to sit through the messy, hard conversations. We're willing to work through the really difficult things in life. We show up when it's not pretty and the house isn't clean and not everything is in place. And there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah. Last night we asked on social media uh, for people to just send experiences or questions, like things that they're wrestling with on this topic. And I mean, this prompt was up for only for hours, but only a few hours. And I just couldn't believe this tidal wave of engagement. And it was heartbreaking, I think, because and we've had this experience a couple times before in tender places in church life, you know. And but this time it was interesting to just see this flood of responses that were very short, just like most of them were like a single sentence or even just a list of things that they hoped that we would get to on this episode. But so many of the responses, I feel like you could put into three different categories of pain. And the first two feel like they were a lot about guilt and stigma, which is interesting because it feels like to me guilt is sort of like an internalized stigma. It's like one is this perception of what the community thinks, and that's the stigma. And then a lot of times the people who were writing about guilt, it's like they were thinking those things about themselves. And it was heartbreaking to just see the same pains over and over. And a lot of people were talking about this idea that's just like deep in their minds that the right answer is stay married, period, and the wrong answer is get divorced, period. And so there was this feeling of if you choose divorce, then you've failed, like you've given up in some way, or you quit, or you couldn't hack it. And I just can't even tell you how many people said something like that, said some version of that. And then on the flip side, this feeling of being perceived that way, that other people felt like they should have tried harder, they could have tried harder. If they tried harder, this wouldn't have happened. So, would you mind just addressing either of those? It just feels like that so much of the pain seemed to be revolving around those two ideas.
Yeah, similar to how we approach the gospel. It's after all that we can do, which means we incorporate things. We go to therapy, we go to counseling, we go to good counselors, not just any counselor. We go to a good counselor. We find a connection with a counselor that's going to be productive and healthy. If there are significant dynamics that are at play, broken covenants, safety is an issue, like those are big deal topics. You wouldn't say to anyone, get in a vehicle that you're not going to be safe in, but stay in there because you were told you were supposed to get in the vehicle. And that's what we do when we approach marriages, which is interesting because we honestly, if we think about it, we would say, get out of that vehicle until it's safe. And instead we're like, nope, ride or die. You got to stay with this person. You made a covenant or a commitment. And quite honestly, most of the time, the difficulties that marriages are facing is because of broken covenants. So I find it interesting that sometimes we are so focused on like, don't get divorced. That's the terrible thing you can do. And that divorce feels like a failure, when instead we should actually be focusing on the behavior and whether that's inside or outside of a marriage. Because that's where the heartbreak really lies. The covenants that are being broken and the breakdown in families that are causing us to be in a position where we're making decisions like that. Because staying in a marriage does not mean it's healthy.
Hmm.
divorce does not mean that it was bad. And I think there's shame when we wonder if we did enough.
Yeah.
The only person that can answer that is you. And I think that we just need to hold on to what we believe about the grace of the atonement, because there will be an algorithm way beyond our comprehension that determines our understanding of the atonement and forgiveness and what the other person in the relationship was going through. And I don't know how all of those pieces of forgiveness and justice interplay, but I think you need to do enough that you have faith that you worked really hard to keep the marriage together, because divorce is not a fun option. It's not like the grass is greener on the other side. There kind of is a trend right now that like being a single parent is kind of cool because you get your kids half the time, and then the other half the time you can act like you're in college again. And I think it's an unhealthy behavior, because you still have to work on really maintaining and growing in healthy relationships, whether or not you're divorced or married. But I think that people need to know they should stay and work on it as best as they can. And that if you put in enough effort into staying and working on things, then you're going to have trust in the decision when you make it. And for some people, it's years. I think if you're intentional about making that choice and decision, you will be led to a way that that doorway's open. It's really scary, especially for women, to file for divorce and have to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. It's not a light choice, and I don't think it should be a light choice. But then after we make the choice, just like after we make a choice to marry someone, you work on it. So if you choose divorce, you better be working as hard as you can with that choice to sanctify it.
Something that you said early on that really is sticking with me is this idea that you claimed your agency. And I feel like that's really empowering, and uses our doctrines in a really healthy way. And I think based on the responses that we got when we put this out there on social media, I think my sense was that a lot of people feel like if it were just up to them, like they would sort of like claim their agency and they would make that very difficult decision. But a lot of people brought the fact that they were worried about kids in the situation, especially not just because like it's gonna have a direct effect on the kids, but then they're thinking about it theologically in the sense of like what's gonna happen with this, with this sealing, and what's gonna happen with our eternal family, which adds another layer of like really deep complication on top of it. So when you think about that situation and combined with this idea that of course we should claim our agency in order to be present in healthy spaces, how do you reconcile those two things?
The sealing power provides the opportunity to continue those relationships after this life, but it does not force us to have relationships with people who are unrepentant, and not working towards a celestial relationship. So I think sometimes there's this fear that if I get divorced, I'm breaking my family apart. But you can still be covenant keeping. And my family is still a family, eternal family, even though I don't currently have someone that's filling the spot of a partner in a marriage unit. And I don't know how all of those things play out, but sometimes we lean so much on not knowing the answer to that we forget to just continue and live our life in a way that we allow the atonement of Jesus Christ to work through some of that stuff. And that takes a lot of forgiveness. Some people immediately when they file for divorce, they want the sealing done and over with, no connection. Others hold on to that for a long time and don't make any choices about it. I think that's a very personal decision. And I think parents often worry about the collateral damage when it comes to their kids, what that looks like, what that's going to feel like. Part of it is the narrative we put around divorce with kids, like broken homes. When we say words like you come from a broken home, they feel broken, but they're not broken. They just have parents who live in two different places. And besides, Christ taught us a lot about things that are broken, and it can be really beautiful too. So the sealing power is one that I think people worry about, that it's a hard line. You are either sealed and in, or you are not sealed and you are out. And we need to remember that the essence of it is that we are sealed to God and that we are sealed to relationships after this life. There's still going to be a lot to sort out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask this, and this might not be a question that should make it into the final cut here, but I am curious. You mentioned a couple times, sometimes you're dealing with someone who's unrepentant, sometimes with someone who has already broken their covenants in some way. I'm curious if, in your mind, for a divorce to be quote unquote justified, if there needs to be at least one party who is at fault, or is a scenario where both parties really are doing everything right, can that still lead to a divorce? Sort of like this isn't working for us for whatever reason, and we've decided to get divorced.
Right. Statistics have shown that empty nesters are at high risk for divorce because they spent a lifetime living together, raising kids, creating this life, and then they recognize they've lost a lot of connection. I think that there are a lot of reasons that divorce is put on the table for people. And I don't think that we are the ones to say, because not every circumstance is that there is a big broken covenant that takes place. But there are elements that you just have to navigate. Some people can navigate a mixed faith relationship. For others, that's a deal breaker for them. And I think what you need to focus on and work towards in regards to being accepting of a choice, if there's not broken covenants, is just where you're planning to go with your life and how you're planning to grow outside of that. I think that we can run the risk of thinking like, oh, we just grew apart, or we fell out of love, or we got married so young. And those are all valid reasons to say that you might be with someone who's different than what you thought they were going to be. And there is some level of recognizing that relationships ebb and flow and grow and digress, even good people in relationships like that. But I would be careful, because there are consequences of divorce, even when it's good people who are choosing a different path. There's a lot of grief and heartache that you go through, even if you think it's a mutually agreed upon choice. So it's a lot to consider. And I think it's very individual as
I saw statistics in it was like an LDS Living article from 2019 that surveyed 1,000 or so Latter-day Saints who are divorced, and it was interesting to me that they asked a reason, and people were allowed to select multiple reasons, but about a quarter of them selected a reason that wasn't about covenants, or it wasn't about adultery or addiction or some of these like quick easy answers like you mentioned at the beginning. And one of the messages that we got last night that was really moving to me was from a woman who said that she just realized that she believed that marriage required sacrifice but not suffering. And
well.
and I saw that sort of written in a lot of different ways in other messages, and that just like I think cut to the heart of it. And it cut to the heart of one of the hardest questions about all of this, which is that, like I liked your car analogy, that like, if you're not safe, get out of the car, and like and it's easy to create this expectation that you should ride or die. But I think where it can feel especially complicated, and where maybe these feelings of like a sensitivity to the stigma or to guilt, is when it's not that it's not safe. It's just like you're car sick, like you've been car sick for decades. And so you're starting to wonder if this is what God's asking of you, if you need to be suffering like this for so long. And if it's okay, I would love to just read this. I don't want to like paraphrase this message, because you can feel how just like honest it is. And this is from a guy who emailed about his own experience. And he said that he was married for 3 decades, a little over 3 decades before they got married. And he said He said, we went to counseling a month after we got married when they were very young and continued in counseling for most of their marriage. And he said this phrase, after all you can do, is what he kept hearing in his head. And he said, it kept me stuck in this loop of creating a new plan to do more, different this time, and for so many years. And he just said, I wasn't going to fail in my marriage. And I felt like I had to live up to the standard of the Lord by doing all I could do. And the consequence was that I was never enough. I had a new plan every week, and it seemed like it always failed. I was told by many and believed that I was supposed to endure to the end because it would all be better in the next life. I believed that for so long that it's what my heavenly parents wanted me to do. I believed that my happiness and joy was secondary to the doctrine, which he put in quotes, or what I perceived to be the doctrine. I had huge guilt and shame for considering a divorce. It felt like God would be so disappointed in me for quitting and being a failure. The shame kept me stuck in the loop. And then a wise friend asked me, how long do you want to live like this? And then he goes on to kind of explain how he started thinking about this differently, and he realized like he didn't want to keep living like this, and like he felt like God was asking him to live in this way that was miserable his whole for 30 plus years. And he eventually decided to leave this marriage and was remarried. And it like made me teary. He talked about this new marriage, and they've been married almost a decade now. And he said it feels like living on a different planet. And it made me sad for him, like that he felt like what he had to do was just do the hard thing for his whole life. Like, so, I mean, not his whole life, but like so much of his adult life, he felt like what God was asking was this like deep suffering. And of course, I think you're right. We can sanctify those decisions, and God can alchemize all of that pain to be a gift. But I think it really gets to the heart of the pain. That I think that's a question for a lot of people. Is God asking me to stay in this place that feels like suffering, or can I move forward in a way that makes me nervous because it's not easy or simple, and it doesn't fit the mold. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about when it's not a quick, easy answer, like when there's not covenants or adultery or addiction, or, like
Yeah.
what if it's just complicated?
Yeah. Well, when you were reading that, I had the thought of a phrase that I've heard before, and maybe you have too. Broken people break people, but healed people heal people. And it
Yeah.
sounds to me a little bit like that was the circumstance. It didn't sound like he was passive in his first marriage of working towards things, seeking inspired guidance in the choices that he was making, and trying to progress and trying to do all these things to and that can feel like a broken record, just going around and around year after year after year.
Mm.
And there are always two individuals in a marriage, and there's accountability for both people. And we cannot push or invoke our agency on someone else. They're going to make their own choices. And if they stay in a victim mentality of thinking that they're not able to make choices, or they can't make choices independently, then that's a hard cycle to get in. And that's a hard cycle to try and get someone out of. It really is. Our gospel is a gospel of growth and progression. And so I think when we feel that stagnant space and maybe sin isn't involved, it's really hard to say, well, it's okay for me to move on from this, or find happiness after this relationship. But the truth of the matter is that a true partnership in marriage, it should feel celestial. Not all the time. You're going to have hardships. I mean, the growth that you have to do in a marriage is tremendous. It's beautiful and heartbreaking, and it'll take us to the ends of our character most of the time. But that's the point. We're supposed to be in these families to work through those things. But similarly to that man, I felt like I had reached a point where it wasn't about my salvation as a unit with that person I was married to. It was about making the choice for myself. And it's hard because in our faith, we're like, be yoked together. You guys have to do everything together. You have to make these decisions together. You have to be one. You have to be on the same page. You have to drag the other one if they're not coming. And sometimes they'll have to drag you. And as we've evolved in just understanding so much more about how complex relationships are, we need to elevate our thinking and understanding that no divorce or separation is as easy as giving a quick answer. It's just not. And a lot of it is coming to terms with it within ourselves. And it sounds like he has in some ways, which is really beautiful, because you can make mistakes and come to terms with those, or you can make the perfect right decision and still be battling with whether or not it was the right decision. It's really an internal work that you have to do. And it's hard because nobody else, they can give opinions, they can give insight, they can give you feedback, but nobody else has to live with that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. The part I didn't read that it is exactly what you said. He talks about realizing that he's gonna be growing and stretching in or out of the marriage, so he can do it now while it's hard in the marriage and leave in a place that feels healthy and like there's genuine love, and then hopefully take that newness into whatever future relationships there are. And but I think there's always this impulse to just simplify, to relieve ourselves of dissonance, and it just feels like it's always going to be a more complicated and rich story, whatever we decide.
Well, and even when you're talking about that, I think that plays into some of the idea that in our faith, we get married really young before we're confident in who we are, or know who we are, or have dealt with our upbringing. And so then sometimes we realize that there might not be as much alignment as we thought when we were 19 and 20 and fell in love with someone because they really were really cute and gave us attention, right? Because now, as a grown adult, there are so many more facets to our personalities, our preferences, our abilities, that it's like a whole new ballgame. You know, you're relearning about someone who was not who you married 20 or 30 years ago. And that can be hard to recognize. Plus, we're living longer. And so, I mean, we need to put that factor in there too. Our marriages are lasting a lot longer,
Yeah.
Yeah.
for
I've
better or
really,
for worse.
yeah, yeah. I've really appreciated your insights on sort of like the internal aspects of this, pertaining to the individual, the partnership, potentially the family. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the like external or cultural factors here, especially like, I think of like my own experience, having had friends and family go through divorces, and like wondering what I can do to make sure that they know that they still belong, that they're still included, that they're still the relationship remains just as strong. And if you have stories here, that could be interesting too. I'm just curious, like when you went through your divorce, what are some things that made you feel included that people did, or maybe some counterexamples, things that didn't help, that made you feel excluded in some way?
One thing I would love to address is that when a divorce happens in a ward, it can cause a lot of ripple effects. Sometimes people feel like they have to choose a side, or they have to be loyal to one person or the other. Sometimes they feel like they don't want to cast any judgment at all, so they're equal to both, and that can be hurtful on both sides too. And so we just need to recognize that emotions are really raw when something like that is happening, especially if there's children involved. And showing up and showing love and support is really important. And you might think it feels awkward, or you aren't sure what to do. You can ask people about how they're doing, specifically going through their divorce. It's healthy for them to talk about it. Also, don't then share that information with everyone else in the ward. I mean, there were times when I recognized that my family was the topic of conversation in ward council. I just knew that they were addressing it. I hope they did so with reverence and love. But sometimes in wards, that does not happen. And we are gossiping or sharing information, or we know that someone's ex is now dating someone else and they seem so much happier, and we have opinions on those things. And that can all be really hurtful. So I think being really conscientious and aware of that. Another piece of that puzzle is 50% of the church members, adults, they're single. So we're not in a minority as single members. And a large majority of the families that are sitting in our church congregations are blended, might be first, second, or a third marriage. So I think having narrative that is not solely focused on just an emphasis on your family has to stay together forever in the exact same unit it started out as would be really helpful. I've shared a story before that sometimes the narratives that we're using can be really painful. And one time when I was sitting in the congregation during a Mother's Day sacrament meeting, it turned into a thankamony for wives. And I just remember feeling just kind of gutted while I was sitting there listening to men that was viewing as righteous and keeping their covenants. And granted, I don't know their circumstances or scenarios, but that's how it looked like on the outside. And they were professing this great love to these amazing women in their lives. And I no longer held the title of being someone's wife.
Mm.
And so I sat through that whole sacrament meeting, not renewing my covenants with Jesus Christ, but like battling this pain that I was feeling, that I was like, I'm not like those families. My family's different. And I had my children there, but even going to church without my kids has been one of the most difficult things for me to do. It is not easy to show up to church alone. It's just not. And so go sit by people, go
Mm.
sit by them. And whether that means you leave your own family or you send one of your kids over to go sit by them, or you take your whole entire row. I think sitting alone at church can be one of the hardest and most devastating things to have to do.
We saw so many really hard messages about this, like this feeling of being so excluded. And I don't have a lot of specific examples that people sent, but you just don't feel like part of the conversation. One person wrote that conversations among couples are always about couples. And so there's
Yeah.
just this feeling of being uncomfortable and left out. And so many people mentioned being very conscious that they didn't fit this ideal eternal family. You know, and in air quotes, it feels like the elephant in the room was a way someone else put it. And so I like this idea, like this an actual action item that, you know, literally sitting alone can just be so painful. Like feeling lonely in a big group is excruciating. Are there other things that you feel like we can do to be somebody's village when they're in this experience, especially when it's complicated and maybe you know both, like maybe you know both the husband and wife, like what can, and I imagine that a lot of the silence that probably feels very judgy and especially ostracizing is about not wanting to say the wrong thing, you know, because
Correct.
every situation's different and like you don't want to, you just like don't know how to bring it up. And maybe you're not that person's best friend. So it feels like, is this my place at all? And so what other thing? I love your, that first example, but like, other things can we do as a community to just make a softer place to land for people who are in this transition?
I think one of the first things that people say when they hear you're going through a divorce is, I'm sorry, which you understand the sentiment of it, but it's not always even warranted because
Right.
sometimes going through a divorce is completely the right thing. So there might be an element of wanting to high five them for making that choice or
Right.
going through that
Yeah.
process. And so just recognizing that um, it's okay to talk to people about things and expressing love to them, but you don't always have to apologize. Divorce is like a death, and yet there's no cards or flowers. There's just a
Right.
lot of silence. And then all of a sudden, you have to reevaluate how you function in the world, but you're minus a huge piece of your past and what you thought was your future.
Yeah.
And it takes time. I would suggest that people not be so uneasy around singles because I either get sympathy because I'm divorced, or the first question out of people's mouth is, are you dating anyone? And I
Mm.
think for some reason, we are not comfortable with someone being a single member of our faith. We're like,
Wow.
if
Yeah.
you are divorced, you should definitely be trying to not be a single person. And I don't love that. In fact, I started my own group, which I call Solo Saints, because I want us to create space for us. It is so healthy to take 3 to 5 years to heal from that. before you are ready to jump into a new relationship, before your kids are ready to have a new relationship to navigate. And it just feels like people are very uncomfortable when someone remains single, especially single men. And then we put in narratives like, well, what's wrong with them? Or why can't they get married? There are so many other layers. Sometimes I've chosen to not be dating because it's not the right thing for my family right now. And that's a conscious choice. And it's not because there aren't good people out there that I could meet or a potential relationship I could find, but I'm making a choice that I feel like is the right thing for my family. I think it's good for us to get out of that wheelhouse and challenge some of those things that we just continue to perpetuate.
Yeah.
I wonder if it'd be okay if I ask one more sort of a follow-up question on that ward council scenario that you brought up. This has been I've been spinning on this a little bit. There was in my um in my case there's been one time where I was in a ward where I felt like a project, but where I felt like definitely some conversation happened about me, and then there are action items coming out of that conversation in which I'm
Yeah.
being fellowshipped, and people are going out of their way. And for me, and this is a genuine question. I'm not sure what the answer will be from you, but like for me, that was like enraging. Like I really, really didn't want to feel like conversations were happening about me, or that there was some inauthenticity to the outreach that I was getting.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, and you highlighted that there's an appropriate way potentially, for these conversations to happen. But is that idea that you might be the subject of some purposeful outreach or fellowship, does that hurt in some way, or is that okay? A genuine question.
I think both are okay, and it's okay if they don't work for you. There was a time that I fully recognized that my family was a central focus, like the experience you mentioned. But I was so grateful for that in regards to my children, because I could not maintain being and showing up as the parent that I wanted to while I was going through some really hard stuff. And amazing people stepped in to pick my kids up for mutual, to bring them treats, to invite them over for a movie night. That was huge. And that was really helpful. But there were times when I felt like I recognized that people were like, her family's struggling. What can we do to help them? And then I would get 3 to 4 texts that week of people saying, hey, we'd love to have you come over for dinner. I haven't seen you for a little while. What's going on? I think you have to recognize that your relationship with Jesus Christ and the things that you're going through is not contingent on how people behave within his church structure. Their opinions, their ways of fulfilling callings, their ways of discussing things in councils should not be contingent on how you are going to show up as a disciple of Jesus Christ. That being said, we definitely need to do better. We definitely need to be better. My hope is that we already have those relationships in place, so when people reach out to us, it doesn't feel like it's part of a project.
Yeah, I think that is what it was occurring to me as you were speaking. Like I could be such a better participant in this type of work, but like it doesn't feel inauthentic, if you have, months or years worth of a relationship, sort of like groundwork having been built, and then something happens, and then those points of connection continue. If it's like all of a sudden, I recognize too that there is good intent in a lot of cases when that happens, but if you haven't laid the groundwork of true friendship and connection, then I think you do risk this that feeling of being a project a little bit more.
Right.
And I wonder if maybe one of the strengths of our faith community is this idea that we all have particular spheres of influence because of our callings, or living near your neighbors, that maybe it's that the kids because you're the primary teacher or the young women's leader, and there might be more natural, really useful ways that you can show love and support in your very particular sphere of influence that somebody else might not be in a position to do as effectively. So I like that idea that maybe there is an authenticity already there, and that's what you're centering on.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just ask, well, two things. What would you say to someone who is just entering this experience, like this big life transition, and maybe thinking about your own experience and the emotions that you were feeling? Like, what would you say to someone who's just stepping into those waters? And then also, what would you say to the people in their life? Like, what do you want their village, their support system to know?
I think what I would say to someone who's just stepping into it is, it's a hard road. It's just a really hard road to navigate. I think one of the biggest fears I had was not having my children with me.
Mm.
And that was one of the reasons that kept me for a long time in my relationship is I could not bear the thought of not having my children with me 100% of the time. And that is very painful. Sometimes people will make comments like, oh, I'm sure it's nice to have a break when my kids are with their dad. And I'm like, you don't understand at all how heart-wrenching that is to not have your children with you, to not have access to them sometimes. And so that pain and that separation and phrases like decoupling have been used before in
Mm.
divorces. It is really an undividing of an intertwined relationship that takes so much work and it's painful. And there are times when things are good and times when they're crazy hard. Um, you have to go back to work sometimes. Sometimes you have to move. I mean, there are all these things that they say are some of the most unsettling things you can do in your life, and they happen all at once. And so that pain is really
Yeah.
real. And I think sometimes people don't understand the magnitude of that. Even if they're making a decision they feel like is the right choice, it is the heaviest burden I've had to carry. It just really is. And it's almost harder when you're like, well, I kind of chose it. I kind of chose that burden. Um, but there is beauty through all of it. And the exact same things that have caused pain in my family, in my life, for my children, are the very things that have also created resilience in them and inspired faith in them. Those exact same things that were heartbreaking and hurtful now have the greatest potential for joy. And I think that's the beauty of not only the human experience, but our journey through the gospel of Jesus Christ, is that it can be both of those things. And I think the hardship happens when we step away from our relationship with Jesus Christ. I think that is where a lot of the wandering and wavering happens, when it gets hard, and then you start to give up that hope. And that's where a lot of that pain, you can stay stuck in it.
Yeah.
And so I think your community makes a big difference. You asked the question about like, what can other people do? Divorce does not leave anybody untouched. I've heard comments from one of my nephews that he was sad that it happened, and I'm like, no one told me that I needed to be prepared to have a conversation with my cute 7-year-old nephew about my divorce. But I
Oh,
did. And it affected my parents. I don't think anyone leaves a divorce untouched. They just don't. And so everyone is processing it in their own ways and navigating through those things. There's anger, there's sadness, there's frustration. And then you're adding in new layers of now these people are creating different lives than what you thought. And it's a lot to navigate. I think extending love and then asking real questions. These are specifics. I let a few people know that it was okay if they were going to keep following my ex on social media, but that I didn't want to see it. And I put up a boundary and said, that's where I'm at right now. I unfollowed a few people that I knew there was going to be some crossover. I'm in a different spot now. And I probably wouldn't have those firm of feelings about it, but you need to be really respectful of what the person who's going through it
mm,
is needing from you. And I think that comes from not guessing or supposing, but actually asking questions. And hopefully they have enough insight to provide some answers to say, I get that you're going to have a relationship with that person that I no longer do, but I hope that you will be respectful and not share any information with them. And say that to people in your life. And I think that will help prevent a lot of heartache. Also, there needs to be grace to the person who's going through it, recognizing other people haven't been through it too, and they're navigating it on their own level. And really what it comes down to is relying on the principles of the gospel that we claim to teach and believe.
Yeah. Well, Anna, thank you so much for sharing so vulnerably and thoughtfully. I think this has really been meaningful. I want to give you a chance. Is there anything you feel like we should have asked that we missed? And like Aubrey said, I think this is certainly a subject we need to come back to again and again, and there's no way we can cover cover all of it in a single episode. But I am curious if there's anything that's really standing out to you that you'd like to share before we close up.
No, I think you guys asked really insightful questions, and I liked all of the feedback that you were getting, because having this be a constant conversation that we're implementing into our wards and families, and recognizing that we can talk about it, we can survive a divorce, we can actually thrive, we can still stay in the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can take a break from it if we need to. All of those things can take place, and not condemning people because of a choice that you honestly don't have privilege to invoke your agency or opinion or judgment on. You just really don't. There will be a day that I will be accountable to the choices that I made, and that's between me and Jesus Christ. And like I said, we do not understand the laws of mercy and justice and how that goes into play. Yeah. People, how they grow up, who they become, the choices that they make. There are so many facets to that development. And thank goodness we have an atonement that can cover those pieces.
I love that Sister Runia brought that up, and whoever spoke right after her also, that we'll never understand someone else's degree of difficulty, and so that's why, of course, our job is to just love. And the other thing that has kept coming back to me as you've been talking is the last interview that we did with Melissa Inouye before she passed away, and her cancer was back, and she was in a lot of pain. And I just remember she had written this book about suffering, and we were asking her to sort of metabolize, like, what does it mean? And like, is it good for you or grow? And I just remember she said that she just believed that the person who's in pain gets to say what it means. And I can always hear her voice saying that. And it feels like that really is true in this situation too, that the person in living the experience gets to say what it all means, and also gets to say exactly what they need. And it feels like a really good reminder to just relax and open our hearts and trust the people who are living this experience firsthand, and find ways to be a community of Christ-like love, especially in these situations that are hard. So thank you so much for just opening up and for all of these insights. I think that this feels like a healing place for a whole community to lean into. So we're really grateful.
Thanks,
and thank you guys for opening up the conversation. I think a platform like this, where we can just start talking about it and not shying away from it, and realizing that it affects us. And I just think it's amazing that we have an opportunity to do that. So thank both of you for the work that you do.
Thanks,
So much,
Anna.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Anna Lott. If Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to rate or review the podcast wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews and the comments, and we love to hear from you. You can also email us at info@faithmatters.org. Thanks again for listening.